All right, lecture number 10, Road to Revolution Part 2. The intolerable acts. The intolerable acts are really a response to the New England behavior to a lot of the other stuff, the sort of rioting, the stuff with the Boston Massacre, the very sort of open resistance to anything that Parliament would pass. So the first of these, the major one of these, is going to be the Boston Port Act, as it points out right here. The damages of the tea needed to be paid, and so the port of Boston was going to be closed until those damages were paid. And remember, this is going to be a big deal because that's kind of how a lot of those merchants made their money. Other intolerable acts, you had the Massachusetts Government Act. As it points out here, basically any official in the government would now be appointed by the king, couldn't be publicly elected. Also, they severely limited town hall meetings, right? The idea was that the governments were basically being seditious and being against the British government. Also, you're going to have a new quartering act that is going to take it a step further from making the people pay for it, but even the fact of holding soldiers in people's private homes. Another act not listed here is going to be the Administration of Justice Act. And the Administration of Justice Act was a way for royal officials to be tried in Britain instead of the colonies. So yet again, this is going to be a situation where it looks like a double standard, right? And that's kind of one of those themes that we've looked at, right? If you're a British official and you break the law, you don't have to stand trial in the colonies. You can go back to Britain to stand trial. Another act that's going to be unpopular is going to be the Quebec Act, right? As you can see in the image right over here, right? Sorry to make that so big, but it's going to extend the province of Quebec, all right? Now, a couple things here. One, it's going to spread Catholicism, which the very Protestant British colonies were not going to like. Also, it is going to cut into that Ohio River Valley territory that the British colonists could not get to, but now the former French colonists could move into. So that's going to also undermine the feelings there as well. So with the Boston port closed, you see the other colonies coming to their help. Right here, right, South Carolina, rice was shipped. Colonies sent food to Boston, and then what's going to happen is you're going to have the summoning of the First Continental Congress. All right, so they're going to meet in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall, which I found a picture of right here. And 12 of the 13 colonies, everybody except Georgia. Now, why wouldn't Georgia not show up? Well, remember, Georgia was the last one formed, and they think probably might have been somewhat more loyal at the beginning to the British. Famous people are going to be there: Sam Adams, John Adams, George Washington, Patrick Henry. So in response to the treatment of Boston and the Intolerable Acts, you're going to get the First Continental Congress, as I just pointed out. And there's going to be sort of two major things that happen. The first is the establishment of the association, like it says right here. And they are going to basically call for a more stringent non-importation. And the big thing with this is they actually even threaten the West Indies to be non-importive from Britain, or they would basically cut off trade with them as well. So that's one. As it says right here, these delegates were not calling for independence yet, right? This is just a body that's going to basically meet to try to figure out a way to twist Britain's arm to sort of get back on board with what they want. The other major thing they're going to accomplish is they are going to lay the groundwork for a second Continental Congress, which is important because it's where we get the Declaration of Independence. So this parliament, right, this group wasn't a legislative body, but they did send their declaration and resolves, which is very similar to the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, except that was for the Stamp Act. This one's for the Intolerable Acts, which Congress did not pay attention to, right? Violators of that trade association, the non-importation thing, were tarred and feathered. And they started to begin moving towards possibly having armed conflict with the British. And so the muskets and gunpowder and stuff like that were available were gathered. And remember, these were kind of rare, not rare items, but they were expensive, and so there weren't a ton of them, right? The British had begun to gather them as well. So, but they did begin to drill openly, which is, yet again, sort of right in the face of the British. And in 1775, the British sent troops to famous Lexington and Concord to seize the gunpowder and the muskets. Famous image of Lexington and Concord here. We'll talk about the famous story of Paul Revere in class. It's not really mentioned here in the notes. The Minutemen, right? The sort of militia men that were there at a moment's notice. That's where the Minutemen get their name. They are going to be woken, and they're going to assemble at Lexington. And as it says right there, they refused to disperse, and so shots were fired. 8 Americans were killed. Then it's basically going to become a guerrilla-style hit-and-run battle until the British are basically pushed all the way back to the port. So the strengths and weaknesses here of America, or the colonies versus the British, you had 7.5 Britons versus 2.5 million colonists. They had a professional army. The U.S. Army was not professionally trained, and that's going to be an issue. And so we'll see Baron von Steuben and the Marquis de Lafayette, and these guys really kind of help whip those guys into shape when we get into the actual revolution. The British had to use mercenaries, and so the mercenaries might not be as motivated as, say, the Americans, who were actually fighting for their homeland. And as it says right here, they were weaker than it seemed. They were using troops in Ireland, right, so they couldn't use those in the New World. And also, the French were waiting to get even, as it says right there, with the British, and so they were more than willing to eventually jump in on the side of the revolution. And we'll talk about that more when we get to that as well. The government in England was inept. Many of the British, right, saw Americans as their brothers and didn't necessarily think it was a good idea to fight them. And also, you had political problems with the Whigs versus the Tories, right? The Tories would have supported the king, and the Whigs would have been against the king. And so the Whigs believed a battle for British freedom was being fought in America. Britain's army in America operated under numerous difficulties, right? Their generals weren't very good. They were also fighting on like away territory, I guess is a good way to think about it. And these delays, right? The fact that they were so far from England, information took too long to get to them. Kind of the stuff I just said. Americans wisely traded space for time. And we'll talk about this more, but the idea that to stretch out this conflict was to the benefit of the colonies. So the American advantages, right? Their leaders were great. George Washington. Eventually, France joins them. Those European officers we talked about, whipping them into shape, and the Marquis de Lafayette with the French. They liked the moral advantage, right, because they saw themselves in the right. And then American rebels were poorly organized. The Continental Congress, right, was not super effective in getting stuff passed. The colonies were too different, and they were not. There was too much of a sort of democratic nature where everybody had a say, and that really bogged down the decision making and legislating that they needed to be doing. So, in the end, it talks about them being a debating society, right? This sectional jealousy, right? This idea of if I'm from Virginia or from New Jersey or whatever, right? That's going to be in there. And the fear of having a strong central government is going to lead to the adoption of the Articles of Confederation in 1781. We'll also look at more of this coming up. The economic difficulties, right? They didn't have the specie or the gold and silver, right? So they printed paper money, and this paper money caused inflation. Besides the stuff we already looked at, you're going to have women helping out, besides what we've already talked about, the ideas of them helping with cloth and running the farms and all that sort of stuff. They're also going to follow the army and help in these ways. And here's the guys getting whipped into shape that I talked about. Blacks fought and died for the American cause. Many states initially barred them from the military, but eventually 5,000 African American guys enlisted, and mostly in the northern states. In your textbook, you'll read about a African American soldier from Massachusetts. It's pretty. I don't remember the guy's name. If I'm say his last name was Few, but you'll read about him in the textbook. And it talks about here how they fought at the battles of Trenton, Brandywine, Saratoga, and the other important battles. The African Americans on the side of the British, right? We already talked about this in class, but a large number of them served to get their freedom, and then they moved to other places in the British Empire. Now, morale in the Revolutionary Army was undermined by American profiteers. What happened is American business saw an opportunity to sell to the British, who could pay in gold, which was at very limited, and they could then also crank up the prices to make a buck. Also, the brutal truth, it says only a minority of colonists selflessly devoted themselves to the cause of independence, and so it might not have affected everyone in the colonies, right? Just a portion of them to actually fight for the freedom of the colonies. All right, the next lecture we'll start looking into the Revolution and get into more of that stuff that we talked about, how we would talk about in the future.